الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين لهم بإحسان وهدى إلى يوم الدين. Alhamdulillah, we started a weekly Q&A session, and many of you have been submitting questions too, so we'll be taking those questions bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. The idea here is basically any questions related to faith or worship or religious guidance are welcome. We avoid, as is our habit, we avoid issues of sectarian controversy, etc. But rather to focus on what's of religious benefit, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So, the first question, inshallah.
So the first question from last week is it permissible to attend gatherings of knowledge or remembrance where there's no physical barrier in between genders?
Is it permissible to attend gatherings of learning where there is no physical barrier between the men and the women? There are two types of rulings in the Sharia. There are some rulings that are intrinsically obligatory or intrinsically prohibited. There is something that's in itself incumbent or in itself impermissible. Right? So with respect to gender relations, for example, there's some things that are in of themselves not permissible, such as for an unrelated man and an unrelated woman to be alone in a room or similar with no third party present or nearby. So that's in itself impermissible. Direct physical contact between an unrelated man and woman is in itself impermissible. Looking with desire at someone of the opposite sex who's not your spouse is directly impermissible. And then there's things that are impermissible because they would lead to the impermissible, right? Insofar as they lead to the impermissible. So the basis of interaction with the opposite sex is that there's caution that is called for, because we recognize the reality of there being desire in actual or potential between men and women. That's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created male and female, that He has placed inclination within us for them. So the basis of gender interaction is caution and restraint. Not because it is haram to interact with the opposite sex, but to be cautious about it. And given the reality of potential harm through falling into the impermissible, that one avoids interaction unless there's clear need or benefit. Unless there's need or benefit, such as learning, such as business dealings, other situations. As long as it's done in a manner, so when there's need or benefit in the interaction, to the extent of the interaction, there's nothing wrong with it, as long as it's done upholding Islamic etiquette, proper manners of that. So, then what about a barrier? A barrier, if it facilitates the reduction of unnecessary interaction, is a means to an end, which is there being dignified restraint in interaction. How that dignified restraint in interaction is manifest in different circumstances may differ. Is it an absolute rule? No, it's not an absolute rule. Has it been one way of facilitating that dignified restraint? Yes, it has been in many cultures, and some it hasn't. Right? So, for that, one would do well to consult local teachers, etc., about what would be suitable in one's circumstances, one should have teachers whom one trusts regarding that. And in different contexts, they may be, and different audiences, there may be different levels of expectations as well. So it's not an absolute requirement to have a barrier. Here at the hub, we do have a barrier, but I will personally give, like if I'm teaching on a university campus, etc., and there is reasonable separation between the men and the women, etc., but the absence of a barrier does not in itself make the gathering impermissible. The next question?
Is it wrong to feel a sense of responsibility or feel bad about guilty about Muslim violent acts that happen around?
Is it wrong to feel guilty about violent Muslim acts? This is something that we have, if you go to the Seekers Hub page, we've addressed in a number of recent responses, such as when the Paris bombing took place, etc., and some of these recent events. We commented upon that, and perhaps we can share some of the links in the feed and as part of the notes to these answers. But it's not an absolute. There's no responsibility. وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. Right? One person does not bear the sins of another. Right? So if someone's parents go and kill somebody, are you responsible? No. Right? We don't believe in collective responsibility. Unless the collective somehow were negligent in fulfilling their duty in preventing harm. Right? So if I'm living with my brother, and my brother chooses to go and kill someone, and I know, then it's common sense. If I knew that they're going to do something harmful and didn't stop them, then I bear responsibility. But I'm not responsible for the actions of others. Each person is responsible for their choices, what's within their capacity. So in that sense, we don't feel any guilt or shyness or even need to explain ourselves insofar as having some presumed guilt. Right? This says, rather we are very clear. We know without any doubt that our messenger, peace and blessings, is nothing but mercy, and the guidance that he has come with is nothing but mercy. Right? If we believe in the Quran as revelation from Allah, then we know that without doubt. Right? And any understanding that is away from mercy has nothing to do with prophetic guidance, even if it is ascribed to it somehow. So we should, if we find that kind of feeling, we should take that opportunity to reconnect with the prophetic example. Right? Learn about prophetic character. Right? To learn about the prophetic example, to learn about the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? And now, alhamdulillah, we have a lot of very good resources in English regarding that. The book Our Master Muhammad by Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin is an extensive work on the prophetic character. Highly recommendable. There's a work by Shaykh Yusuf Nabahani on the character of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, translated by Shaykh Abdul Aziz Suraqa, and it's published by Al-Madina Institute Publishing, and many other such books. We have some very good books. If you go to Firdaus books or Mecca books, you find a whole range of excellent books on prophetic character. So this is the one we follow. This is the one when we affirm there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. The message from Allah is embodied in the messenger. Right? And his example is preserved. Right? And the truth claim of the Quran could not be true, that we have not sent you except as mercy to mankind. So these acts of random violence being done, could anyone say they're mercy? No. But the Prophet ﷺ was sent as nothing but mercy. They fail the basic, we can call it the mercy filter. Right? So, we say it. Now, we do have a responsibility to make clear the way of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? These are opportunities to make clear what did he come with. But not just as religious diplomacy. We're not here to be politicians. That, well, as Muslims, we're not like that. What did you achieve? Right? Rather, the way of the Prophet ﷺ is to call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Tell them about Allah. What do you believe? Whom do you believe in? Who is your messenger? What is his message? Okay? And sometimes we feel hesitant because we're not clear about whom we believe in. Whom do we follow? Right? So we should take it as a positive opportunity to learn. And then when we clarify, our clarification should be calling to Allah, calling to the way of His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Next question.
Can one use toothpaste while fasting?
We have a number of answers on that in the Seekers Hub answers. You cannot swallow toothpaste while fasting because swallowing toothpaste or saliva affected by toothpaste would break your fast. But the use of toothpaste does not in itself invalidate the fast unless you swallow, right, the toothpaste itself or saliva affected by it. Anything that could reasonably break your fast, deliberately choosing to do so, in general, is disliked. Because breaking your fast is prohibited. That which comes close to something takes something of its rulings. So deliberately choosing to put anything in your mouth that you could end up swallowing and thereby invalidating your fast would be disliked if it's without reason. So toothpaste in general would take that ruling as well. After the fast begins, one would avoid it, but there are circumstances, particularly if someone's going to work, etc., and that if your breath is affected, then if you are to use toothpaste, and when there's a need, and it's dislike, it's not prohibition, right? If there's a need, then just use very little toothpaste and rinse your mouth. And if you rinse out once, you're considered to have rinsed out the toothpaste. Any residual taste after that is excused. So if there's no need, it's Saturday, you're at home, and if you take care of your oral hygiene, and you brush before the day starts, you should make it to the end of the day. Don't have garlic at suhoor time. And also, it's useful to learn how to use a toothstick, a siwak. Because the toothstick, right, the siwak or the miswak, does not require any external agent in order for you to brush your teeth. Right, so if you keep a toothstick, learn how to use it. Right, it's very useful. You can use it all day. Now, you keep it moist so that the ends don't come off. But again, you use it once, and then you rinse your mouth out once, and that's enough. And you can use the toothstick in the Hanafi school all day. In the Shafi'i school, only up till the midday. Right? So that's the ruling of using the toothstick. Any other questions?
If one buys a certain type of food, for example, a cookie, but one does not know whether it has lard or not, or i.e. pig fat, is one sinful to buy and eat this food, regarding that one tried to ask for the ingredients but no one in the store knows?
So the question was, you chose to buy food, you went to a store to buy food, and you don't know what the ingredients are. Now, they say overall there's 3 levels of caution. Right? There's caution regarding what you do regularly. Right? And then there's that which you do often. And then the third is what you do exceptionally. And as comments and the fuqaha distinguish between these 3 levels of caution, why? Because let's say, most of the time, the things we buy regularly, right, it's not a hardship to find out properly, okay, this is clearly legitimate. You find out once, and then, you can exercise, you can set some caution, like a higher level of caution regarding it. But, when you're traveling, etc., the threshold of caution is somewhat lower in general terms. If one wants to be cautious, one thing to be careful about is that you can't square a circle, right? You can't act in ways that are not cautious and try to be cautious in those ways. Okay? So you say, okay, I want to eat at Boston Pizza, and to be really careful that what they're serving me is legitimately halal. Why? Because the very act of going to Boston Pizza, in a place where they serve alcohol and they serve non-zabiha meat and the possibility of contamination is very high, etc. How can you combine that with trying to be cautious? Right? And people contort themselves in strange ways by trying to do so. So, if you want to be cautious, there's an approach to caution. The first is learn soundly. Don't try to figure it out yourself. So caution, they say broadly, requires three things. The first is learn the guidance of Allah and His Messenger regarding the thing you want to be cautious about. And it'll actually make your life much easier than other ways of trying to be careful. So some people, like I know people, without exaggeration, who called the manufacturer of the glue used in their shoes as to whether there was any prohibited ingredients in it. Because they not only contacted the shoe manufacturer, but they found out, okay, well, they went down right till the glue. And no one would, even if the glue was made from pig, it would be excused. Right? And you're not responsible for finding out that one. No one would say that kind of investigation is required. So the impulse to be cautious is a natural impulse of someone seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, taking their religion seriously. But the first step in caution is learn what you're responsible for, reliably. That's the first step. Without that, your caution will be miserable and confusing. You'll go into excess, and it'll be unsustainable for you, and you'll cause a lot of commotion within your family, in your circles, and so on. So that's the first step. Learn. And you'll find that some things are much less strict than you thought they were. And other things that you didn't imagine were so important are actually that important. Right? So that's something we would recommend. So gain caution. Now when it comes to food, can you buy something or eat something that you don't know all the ingredients of? You start with, first look at the general case about what you're getting. Some things, the general case is that they're permissible. And the likelihood of there being an impermissible ingredient in them is very low. So for example, if you get, if you buy salad, right? You go to a buffet and there's salad. What's the likelihood that there'll be haram ingredients in salad? Hardly, right? Unless they say with bacon bits or with chicken or with some meat. Right? Now you want to be cautious. Say, is this, is there any meat in this or whatever? And say no. It's very straightforward. Right? So you start with what's the starting point. And there's other things in which very often there are problematic ingredients. Okay? So going back to experience and common sense. So for example, if you're buying jelly, is it often that there'll be some problematic ingredients in jelly? Yeah, because jelly uses gelatin a lot, and gelatin is a differed upon ingredient, right? It's problematic. So that would require caution. But if you're buying coffee, do you have to even worry about the ingredients? No, because What you add? What would you add in coffee? Milk, cream. There's no issue. Sweetener, if it's you buy bad coffee. It's far-fetched. But then there's things that are borderline. Right? Those borderline cases are the ones that cause problems. And practically, that's where the way out of it is to avoid too many processed foods, things that have many ingredients. Because the more ingredients there are in something, the more likelihood there is that there's something that could be problematic. So the practical way of caution in it is eat real food, and it'll be clear. You don't need 56 ingredients in the apple pie that you're buying. If you've got 56 ingredients, just don't buy it. That's the caution, right? Because how many ingredients does apple pie need? Like 6, 8 main ingredients, maximum. Okay? So that's part of, there's a practical way to caution, right? Practical way to caution.
Is the definition of yateem, orphan, limited to only people whose parents are dead, or does it include people whose parents have abandoned them?
So yateem itself, orphan refers to one who's lost one or both parents, right? But an abandoned child is like an orphan, right? In that a child who's orphaned needs a guardian. Right? They need a kafil, someone who will take on their guardianship and raise them because they don't have their parents. A child who's been abandoned may have biological parents, but such a child is also in need of guardians. Because if the parents have abandoned the child, with or without reason, there can be some cases where the child was abandoned for reason. Someone is having mental health issues. They had a child, and due to stress or due to other factors, they now have mental health issues. There may be a legitimate reason why someone gave up their children, right? And one should not judge someone who gave up their children because you don't know the circumstances they had the child in. In some parts of the world, after cases like rape and other things, there's so much social stigma. They may be fearing for their life. So they abandon a child due to that. So we should not be hasty to judge, but rather we have to be hasty in taking responsibility. That if there's a child that's abandoned, for example, that the guardianship of a child who is orphaned or abandoned is of the greatest things that a believer can do. The Prophet ﷺ, the one who takes care of an orphan will be like this with me in paradise. And the Prophet ﷺ brought two of his fingers very close together. And the adab with that hadith is not to raise one's fingers and point in that way. Because the Prophet ﷺ, we don't have a narration of the Prophet ﷺ of how he pointed. And that's the caution in narrating hadiths. But there's tremendous reward in kafalatul yateem, in guardianship of a child. And one of the great, the lack of knowledge is so harmful, and lack of, superficial study of Quran and Sunnah can be so damaging. Because yes, there's a difference between the guardian being regarded as the actual parent of the child, right, which is not accepted in the Sharia, but that is not to say that we do not believe in the importance of taking care of orphans, of adopting an orphan, right? And the adoption that is recognized in the Sharia is an adoption of guardianship, which is, for example, in many countries, including Canada, that's the default. That if someone adopts a child who is left abandoned by their parents, or given up by their parents, the default is that that's considered a guardianship arrangement. And the default is that the child is encouraged, that they encourage that the child be made aware of their biological parents, and the means be taken for them to be able to gradually reconnect with their biological parents too. So they have two sets of parents, their biological parents and their guardian parents. And this is something that there's great ignorance of in the Muslim community. It's a fard kifaya, communal obligation to take care of orphaned Muslim children. And not just orphaned Muslim children, other children who are orphaned. Right? We should be, this is one of the qualities that the Prophet ﷺ most strongly encouraged. Right? Taking care of widows, taking care of orphans, right, are two of the greatest of spiritual works. So that's something that we should strive to excel in as a community. Right? We should be taking on so many children, adopting so many children, and taking such good care of them that you say, well, you should send those children to the Muslims because they take good care of them. Okay? I have a friend who I'm proud to call a friend in another Western country. They took on temporary guardianship of some little girls because their mother had a very rough life. And subhanAllah, the mother, then they said, she's suffering from some really grave crises. She got better, and they said, well, now the children can return to the mother. So the mother, the actual biological mother, said, no, I'm so impressed by the way these guys are raising them. Can they continue to raise them? I'll be part of their life. And the kids loved the guardian parents, who'd only consider, they only agreed to take them on for a couple of years. And later, when the girls were like 7 and 8 or whatever, the mother requested that, can you please teach them about Islam? Because I want them to be like you are. Please, because I don't want them to suffer as I have in life. Okay? And they never imposed anything. They said, we'll respect, like your wishes. Say, no, but involve them in whatever you're doing. And said the mother really was. But they didn't take her to, they're just taking care of the worldly upbringing of the child and this, broad values and so on. But the children were so impressed. And the mother said, no, follow that way. And this is something that we should take very, very seriously.
Is dying on Thursday noon but being buried at night the same as dying on Friday in terms of merits?
Now, dying on Friday, there's some things that one takes a good, like a bishara from, a glad tiding, but, these are things that, dying refers to when you die, right? And if you die on a Friday, but one should neither hope to die on a Friday, because the sunnah with respect to dying is, the Prophet said, لا يتمنين أحدكم الموت. Let none of you hope for death. لِضُرٍّ أَصَابَهُ, for any distress that befalls them. But rather, why? Because the general sunnah is, the best of you are those whose lives are long and whose works are good. But the Prophet ﷺ continued, فَإِنْ كَانَ لَا مَحَالَ, but if you have to, right, because you're really hard up, then say, اللهم أحيني ما دامت الحياة خيرا لي وأمتني إن كانت الموت خيرا لي أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. That Allah, make me live for as long as living is good for me, and make me die when dying is better for me. Right? So that's the general case, right? So dying on Friday, it's not something, you don't choose when you die, right? And you don't choose when someone else dies. If time has, if someone's time has come, their time has come, right? And in those end of life situations, right, where if someone, for example, they're going to switch off their their life support, for example, etc. In those kinds of cases, then if the decision needs to be made, then the decision is made based on the need of the best interest of the person, not on, let's keep them alive 3 more days, so it goes to Friday. There's no basis for that in the Sunnah, right? Wallahu a'lam. And in terms of in terms of issues of life support and so on, we have a few answers on seekers related to life support and the guidance related to that. Life support is like medical care, it is not an obligation to keep someone on life support. But assisted suicide, in taking an active means to end someone's life, is not permissible, right? So one could switch off. I mean, this is a very gross simplification of a nuanced matter, but if someone is on life support, one could take them off the life support machines, right? One can give them medication that would cause them to lose their sense of pain or even lose consciousness, so they don't experience pain as they die. But one cannot give them medication or do something that will itself terminate their life, right? So assisted suicide is not permissible, but giving someone, ceasing life support is permissible. And there's some nuance related to that. We have a few answers that touch upon it. We're working on some more detailed answers regarding that, because it's an important issue. We'll take one more question and stop. Any questions here? We have like a slew of questions.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll just take.
Okay, so there are two questions that are related.
Okay, so go ahead.
If a person applies for a job and the salary for the job comes from lottery money, will the earning be halal? As some jobs are funded by lottery money. And related to that, there's another question: is it permissible to work in places like Walmart, Tim Hortons, or a warehouse that some products?
That's not totally unrelated. We'll take one and then the other. They're different. Okay. So, can one work in a situation where the source of the money may be impermissible? There's some nuance to this question. This happens particularly in certain countries, right, where large charities or a lot of government funding for particular types of charities is through lotteries and the like. So the fiqh related to it is that you cannot work in a line of work that is in itself impermissible. So you cannot do things that are haram for someone whose primary activity is something that is directly impermissible. Those are the two things that, in terms of the permissibility of your employment, that you cannot do the haram for someone whose primary activity would be considered haram. Right? So you cannot, so if you're working, you have to see what's their line of work, and but if a company has a range of activities, some of them impermissible. So you work for a publishing company. Is publishing permissible? In general? Yes. So you can work in publishing even if some of what they publish is impermissible. But you cannot be working in their pornography department or whatever, as is obvious, right? Because you cannot be working in the haram for someone whose the work itself, that their line of activity is directly impermissible, right? So but then of course many complicated issues come. Can you work for the maker of firearms? And fiqh-wise you can, because do firearms have a legitimate use? Yeah. In war they do, in self-defense they do. So whatever, within the parameters of law and fairness. Now you're not responsible if many use them in impermissible ways. But there's an element of dislikedness that when you have discretion, you avoid things that are associated with the impermissible to the extent you can. But we don't always have the luxury of choice in that. A third governing criterion with respect to employment is that we do not hold non-Muslims responsible for the rulings of the Sharia. It's simple as that, right? We do not hold non-Muslims responsible for the rulings of the Sharia. Now, we cannot do the wrong and we cannot be directly party to what we hold to be wrong. But if you're in a non-Muslim country and, let's say there's a foundation or an endowment or some source of funding that the source of funding is fully from lottery or some other mode of gambling or whatever, can you accept that funding in itself? Yes. Because we do not hold non-Muslims responsible for the rulings of the Sharia. Just as if your next door neighbor owns a company called, only beer. Right? They sell beer and only beer, called Bob. Beer and only beer. So they don't sell anything but beer. Not even chewing gum. Like nothing. Beer and only beer. And they invite you for food. Can you transact with someone? Because we do not hold non-Muslims responsible for the rulings of Sharia. But if your friend Bob, your neighbor Bob becomes Muslim, then the standard changes. Because now we do hold them responsible. So the standard would change. In those cases, there's fiqh related to it. But broadly, this is a guiding principle. So we cannot be engaged in the haram, but we don't hold them responsible for those things. Right? So if you have, so in those cases, if there's funding from those kinds of sources, it is permissible to take. But if someone were to choose to avoid it, that's a consideration of caution, right? But some scholars suggest one could take it for secondary purposes, right? Like don't build a masjid using lottery money from the government, for example, right? There's sacredness to it. But if you have projects to feed the homeless, etc., use it in things that are social purposes rather than religious purposes. And those things is best to consult about. Allah. So that's with respect to the lottery. And the same principles apply to Walmart, working for a company that sells some impermissible things, that if the work you're doing is permissible and the line of work of the company you're working in is permissible, it is permissible to work in that. We have a whole slew of answers on Seekers Hub about the principle of assisting in sin. And especially the Hanafi school is quite expansive when it comes to the issue of assisting in sin, and it distinguishes between what is direct involvement and indirect involvement. That at the level of moral obligation, you're not morally culpable for things where the relationship between you and the sin committed is indirect. But where you can avoid it, it's superior. So let's say if you own a shopping mall, do all the shops in your shopping mall have to be Sharia compliant? No. They have to comply with the law. Right? So if you're, let's say, in a Muslim country, and because some things are public responsibility, right? So upholding the Sharia publicly is a public responsibility. It's not your direct responsibility. We're not God's policemen on earth. Okay? So what the laws are, what can, in that sense, that is the public responsibility. So if we're operating in a Muslim society, we'd have to keep in mind what the public law is and be within that. And in a Muslim society, we'd have more personal responsibility because we hold that Muslim person is morally responsible. So we deal with them accordingly. But even in a Muslim society, and the fuqaha use this example in Hanafi fiqh. Let's say if you have a storefront, let's say, and you're going to rent it out to someone who's going to use it as a temple for idol worship. Are you allowed to rent that place out? Let me ask you guys a question. Are you allowed to rent it out? So the Hindu World Association, or they call it WA, World Association of Hindus, right? WA, right? Comes to you and say, we want to lease this unit to use as a temple. Can you rent it out? Can you? In the Hanafi school, you can. Because what are you doing? You're renting out a space. That's what you're doing. Is your usage permissible? The act of you renting out a space permissible? Yes. Could they use it in a permissible way? Yes. Are you directly assisting them in that which is wrong? No, you're not. That's by their choice. Now, there's a public regulation of it in a Muslim society. You know, the local authorities, etc., zoning, etc. Just as, and sometimes people wonder how come non-Muslims can't do certain things in Muslim countries, and the answer is very simple. Have you ever heard about zoning laws? Like, we just moved to a new house. Could we rent the place we rented on wherever we rented it? Could we turn it into Seekers Hub 3.0? No, because the area is not zoned like that. So in traditional Muslim society, that's zoning. In Muslim areas, there's certain things that you can't do. In Christian areas, you can do whatever you feel like, right? It's common sense. So that's not considered assisting in sin. But where you can avoid it, right? You have two offers. One, someone wants to open a coffee shop, and someone wants to open something that we would hold to be wrong. Then when you have a choice, you choose what's better. But it's an important principle to be clear about. If you go to Seekers Hub, you'll see a number of answers on the principle of assisting in sin for more detail on that. But of course, that does not preclude caution where it's within your discretion to exercise caution. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So sometimes life is complicated, right? That if you have two options, right? The coffee shop versus a beer store, right? And of course, even in Canada, we have a lot of zoning requirements. You can't just open a beer store anywhere, right? So compliant, and Islam is not some foreign fantastical entity. Many of these public regulations are for the same reason, for regulation of public interest. You can't just open it. Like even if you're Christian, you can open in a Christian area because that's where presumably the alcohol drinkers would be. Right? Travelers used to say, if you go to the Muslim world, look for the church steeples, because that's where you'll find the liquor stores. And it's certainly true in Damascus. I only know because I used to walk through the Christian area, see the church, see the liquor store. But yeah, sometimes personal considerations come in, right? That you're not breaking even. You purchased a mall, you're not breaking even. That's the biggest unit. Sometimes in life there can be a mix of considerations. There can be a mix of considerations. Sometimes it is haram for you to do what's more cautious. Let's say you are managing. You're a property manager for a third party. Can you there choose to do what's more cautious by your religious standards? Even if they're a Muslim, you have to act in accordance with the expressed best interest of the party that has entrusted you. So you're not allowed to be cautious. Right? If you work as a taxi driver, right? For, let's say, an airport, one of these airport taxi services. You're not working independently, right? Can you choose to avoid taking certain types of customers? No, because you are harming your employer. Now, if it's your own, because your employment is a trust. You're working for someone else, and you have a limit of what your trust is. Okay, so this is where knowing the principles related to what is assistance in sin and what is not are very important. Because you can be cautious with your own choices, but you cannot be cautious when it comes to someone else's advantage. that you disadvantage them out of your own caution, right? And this comes up a number of times in different countries where Muslim taxi drivers refuse to pick up customers from the airport because they're carrying alcohol from the duty-free shop. It'd be haram to refuse that because contractually you have to. And it's not prohibited in your religion because you're taking someone from point A to point B. What they have on them is not you're not responsible for that. It's a very interesting issue, the issue of assisting in sin, because there's so much fiqh related to it. Can someone work here in Canada as pizza delivery for pizza? What's the most common type of pizza that is sold? No prizes for guessing. Pepperoni pizza. Right? Pepperoni is haram, but can you work in delivering pizzas? What are you doing? You're taking a box from place A to place B. You're not responsible for that. Can you sell pepperoni pizza? That's a separate thing. No, you can't when you have choice. Right? That's a separate matter. Right? But the delivery, now if you have a choice, you try to choose something else. But we don't live in an ideal world. Right? Because you also have a responsibility for providing for family and paying your debts and expenses and many, many things. So that's where there's a balance of considerations. But even in the other last point to make, the last point to make is that sometimes when we get in a hard situation, there can be exceptions. Sometimes there are exceptions. Because that's the balance of the Sharia. I was asked, and I asked this question of some senior scholars, because there's a difference between a general ruling and a specific application. That, let's say, there's a difference between someone opening a pizza store and saying, well, I'm going to sell pepperoni pizzas that, like regular pepperoni from pork. You can't do that. But what if you took over? Let's say someone lost their father died, and the whole family's wealth is invested in a particular franchise, and they do not give you an exemption to sell non-pork pepperoni. What do? You have to just get rid of the store immediately? In those exceptional cases, those require specialists. Don't give yourself a fatwa. Either that no, I have to get rid of it, or no, I can keep it. Because those are sensitive cases. And those are sensitive cases and they require caution. And sometimes our religion, the way of the Prophet ﷺ balances two amazing qualities. Principle and pragmatism. Right? But not expedient pragmatism that leaves principle, but also not principle that is rigid and unconcerned about well-being. Right? There's a balance that the Sharia has come with. And those sensitive cases, they require, one should go to experts to deal with those kinds of cases. Because and many of these issues come up. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for facilitation and success. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.